they also revered other gods alongside Yahweh. Saliently, I would mention Anat, which appears to be some kind of perhaps a consort.
Welcome to KEDEM Channel, and I am very glad to host today our dear friend, Professor Yonatan Adler. Welcome.
Thank you for coming.
Last time we spoke with you about beginning of Judaism. And today I would like to ask you, what was before that?
Before we have Judaism. So that's an excellent question. And we need to understand that before Judaism, we still have Jews. So the Jewish people is a identity group that we have for many hundreds of years before something that we could call Judaism begins. And that exactly the question that you're asking, what do we have before Judaism starts, is what I deal with in the book. So the book's title is Between Yahwism and Judaism, Judean cult and culture during the early Hellenistic period. So exactly the question that you asked is what I look at in this book. In my first book that we discussed last time we sat together, The Origins of Judaism, I look at the question of when Judaism first begins. And what I do there, as you recall, is I look at actual evidence that we have for practices that relate to Torah observance. And what I showed there is that in the first century of the Common Era, we have a lot of evidence indicating that Jews were keeping the laws of the Torah. So it's both textual evidence and archaeological evidence. Things like ritual immersion pools and stone vessels, the dietary laws, abstinence from figural art, and so on and so forth. We have tefillin, phylacteries, and mezuzot, just a list of laws that Jews were keeping in the first century of the Common Era. What I did in the first book, in the Origins of Judaism, is I go backwards in time from the first century of the Common Era to the first century before the Common Era to the second century of before the Common Era, looking for evidence that any practices that relate to Torah law.
So to track it down in time to see when we see these rituals emerge.
Exactly. And what I showed was that there's no evidence before the middle of the second century before the Common Era, which is the Hasmonean period. Before that, we have no evidence that Jews were keeping any of these laws on any wide-scale basis. And on that basis, I showed that essentially the earliest evidence we have for what we could call Judaism is in the middle of the second century before the Common Era, the Hasmonean period. What I'm calling Judaism here is the definition that I use in my book is the Judean way of life governed by Torah law. And my interest there in the first book was in the ordinary people. So not the intellectuals, not the writers, not the elites, let's have you, but the ordinary people, the people you would meet in the street, you would meet in the marketplace, if you were to go out into the fields, the people plowing the fields, the ordinary people. So that's my definition of Judaism, and we don't have any evidence for that before the Hasmonean period. What I'm doing in this book is attempting
one step
going one step backward, exactly, attempting to answer the question, what was going on right before that? What was going on in the period immediately before the Hasmonean period, immediately before the Hasmonean revolt and the independent state that the Hasmoneans established?
Maybe before we go into the details of the practice of ordinary Judeans or Israelites, could you maybe elaborate more on the period itself?
Yeah, sure.
What's going on there, geopolitically wise,
Sure.
in Judea specifically?
Sure. Okay, so that's very important to give a background of what's going on. So our period begins, again, we're talking about the early Hellenistic period, begins with the conquests of Alexander the Great in the east. So Alexander the Great leaves the area of Macedonia, of Greece, in the year 334 BCE. He crosses to what's today Turkey and very quickly conquers essentially the entire Middle East and beyond. Right? He reaches pretty soon as far as India in the east, Egypt in the west, down to the borders of Ethiopia in the south. And our area, Judea, is one small part of these larger areas that Alexander conquers. Alexander dies in 323 BCE, and his kingdom is divided up amongst his generals. This division, it's a bit of a messy division, and the land goes back, Judea goes back and forth between a couple of his generals. The two main figures that take the stage of history are Ptolemy, who takes the south, he takes Egypt, establishes his capital in Alexandria, and Seleucus, who establishes his kingdom in the east, in Babylonia, Syria, that whole area. And the land of Israel, so Judea, goes back and forth during this time, the southern Levant goes back and forth during this time between the descendants of Ptolemy, they're all called Ptolemy, and Seleucus, the descendants of Seleucus, during the course of the 3rd century before the Common Era. During this time, I should be more accurate, during the 3rd century, the land is under Ptolemaic rule. It's towards the end of the 3rd century that the land switches over to Seleucid rule. And we have Seleucid rule for the next 25 years until the ascension of a man named Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who is the Antiochus of the Hanukkah story. So I am going to be looking at this entire period until the rise of Antiochus IV, and we'll call this the early Hellenistic period. The late Hellenistic period will be the period when we have the Maccabean revolt and the emergence of the Hasmonean independent polity, afterwards kingdom. So that'll be the late Hellenistic period. We're going to be focusing on the early Hellenistic period, which is the period before the Hasmoneans come to power.
Okay, so this is the point in time where we see the difference between the emerge of Judaism and the cult of Yahwism.
Okay, so let's slowly let's get into that. So, like I said, the title of my new book is Between Yahwism and Judaism, and perhaps here's the place where I should unpack what I mean by Yahwism, what that term means, because it might not be so familiar with your viewers. It's certainly not a term that's used on a day-to-day basis today.
Yeah, I suggest we go together with you in the time machine back in time. We sit now in Judea in front of class full of locals.
Okay.
And you ask them, I am Professor Adler, and I would like to ask you, what do you believe in? What is your practice?
Okay.
What are your rituals?
Exactly.
What they will tell you.
Okay, so let's unpack what the term Yahwism means. It's not a term that would have been used by anyone in ancient times. Judaism does appear in ancient sources. Yahwism certainly doesn't. So what do we mean when we use that term? When we talk about ancient Jews, and it's important for me to make this clear, there were Jews before there was Judaism. Okay, again, if Judaism means the observance of Torah on a wide-scale basis and the way of life governed by Torah law, we can have Jews, and we do have Jews that don't have that their lives are not governed by the laws of the Torah. Jews, or the name Jews appears, Judeans, appears already in the 8th century before the Common Era, and presumably the term was being used, even though we don't have evidence for it, for some time before that. The earliest written sources we have are from the Assyrian sources that refer to Hezekiah, the Judean. So there certainly were a people who called themselves and were called by others Judeans. That's there's no question about that. That says nothing about what their beliefs were and what their practices were. You have Judeans that presumably had some kind of Judean culture just like Syrians had Syrian culture and Egyptians had Egyptian culture and Greeks had Greek culture and so on and so forth. So that says nothing about any kind of Judaism, okay? So it's very important to make it clear that there's this distinction between having Judeans and having Judaism.
So it's more than just the what we call today religion or cult. It's also the language, the local version of the language.
We can speak of culture in general
When
as a larger way of looking at what people are doing and how they're running their lives.
when Assyrian senior Ravshakeh comes to Jerusalem, the language he speaks is referred as the language of Judeans.
Of the Judeans, exactly. Yeah.
So it's already some kind of mentioning this.
Sure. Okay, exactly. Yeah. So it's important to recognize that we have culture. There's no every group has its culture. So now one part of that culture that we can talk about is what today we would call religion. So let's say a belief system and practices that surround that. We know from even the 9th century before the Common Era that Judeans and Israelites as well in the northern kingdom, but we're going to be focusing on the Judeans, have a belief in their own God, the God that's spelled YHWH, right? So pronounced by scholars today as Yahweh. We don't really know exactly how it was pronounced in the past. We find this Judean God mentioned in the Mesha already in the 9th century before the Common Era. And around this time, we begin to see, when we have the first names of Judeans that appear in the written record, we see this name appearing as a theophoric element in Judean names, which means that, like my own name, Yonatan, right? So that's Yonatan, which is the
Yahweh gave.
Exactly. And so we begin to see names like this which appear in the written record, and it's clear that this is the national god of the Judeans. And as a result, scholars begin to speak of something called Yahwism, which refers to some kind of belief and practice system which centers on the Judean God. And the idea is to distinguish this from Judaism, which we only see later on. So the question that interests me is, how can we characterize this Yahwism in the period before we have Judaism? So again, the book is going to be focusing on the early Hellenistic period, but scholars have spoken about the Yahwism in the Iron Age and in the Persian period. And especially recently, scholars have been talking about Yahwism in the Persian period as well, which is something which perhaps in the past hasn't been what the way scholars have been thinking about the Persian period. In the past, scholars have thought of Judaism already in the Persian period. More recently, scholars have recognized that actually the Persian period is in many ways a continuation of what we have in the Iron Age, and that we should still be talking about Yahwism in the Persian period. So just to give a couple of examples, we've spoken about Elephantine and the Judeans living in Elephantine and the character of their culture. They had their own temple to the Judean god, which they called Yahweh. But they also revered other gods alongside Yahweh. So, for example, when they collected monies for Yahweh, these monies were afterwards given to other gods as well. Saliently, I would mention Anat Yahweh, which appears to be some kind of perhaps a female consort to the male chief god Yahweh. These are Judeans living in the Persian period in the 5th century before the Common Era, and they're naming their children with the Judean god's name, but also with other gods. So,
and it seems actually that those people in the Egypt of today, it seems like they do not have a text of Bible in front of them.
Absolutely.
At least not in the form which we know today.
No, absolutely. In no form. There's no reference at all, no citation from any biblical texts. The Pentateuch doesn't appear anywhere. Moses doesn't appear anywhere. They don't seem to know of any of the biblical texts, at least from what's survived from the writings of the Elephantine Judeans. There's no reference at all to anything that we have in our Bible. So scholars have come to recognize that in Elephantine, for example, we should speak of Yahwists and Yahwism as opposed to Judaism. And the same goes for, by the way, findings that we have from Mesopotamia. The Al Yahudu and the Al Murashu archives don't refer at all to any of our biblical texts. And again, we seem to have a polytheistic tendencies amongst the Judeans living in Mesopotamia. And there's good reason to think that the situation was not that different in Judea itself. So we're talking here about the Persian period. Like I said, scholars tend to speak about Yahwism during this period rather than Judaism in recent years. What I am doing in this book is I'm going to the next period, to the early Hellenistic period. And the question that I'm asking is, should the early Hellenistic period be should we look at the early Hellenistic period as a continuation of the Persian period, of the Yahwism of the Persian period? Or is there any reason to think that already in the early Hellenistic period, we have something that looks like Judaism already appearing? That's the question that I'm asking. Do we have here a continuation from the Persian period, or is there some kind of rupture? Is there something new that appears in the early Hellenistic period? And there's good reason one might think that the early Hellenistic period is the beginning of something new, right? The early Hellenistic period is when, for the first time, we have this new culture, this Greek culture that appears on the stage in the East, in the Levant especially, right? For the first time, we have reason to think that Greek culture would have been brought to the region, which is something very new. Until the conquests of Alexander the Great, this area had been under rule of whether it's Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians. All of these are Eastern cultures. For the first time, we have what we might call a Western culture, a very, very different kind of culture, which is brought into the region. So there might be a reason to think that with this rupture, this cultural rupture of Hellenism, of bringing in this new Greek culture into the area, perhaps that might have been a catalyst for the emergence of something like Judaism, which we first really get to see under the Hasmoneans. So that's the question that I'm looking at. Do we have a continuation from the Persian period into the early Hellenistic period, or should we regard this as some kind of cultural rupture?
Professor Adler, could you please explain what means? What means do you have to examine the beliefs of people at that time?
Okay, so that's a very good question, a very difficult question to answer. What are our sources of information? The early Hellenistic period, like the Persian period, but I would say the early Hellenistic period is even more problematic. The sources of information we have are few and far between. So this is very, very important to put on the table when we're talking about what kind of evidence we have. When we're talking about literary sources, let's start with that. We do have some literary sources that we think were written during this early Hellenistic period. I'll mention, for example, Ben Sira. That one we could be pretty sure was written probably towards the end of the 3rd century, beginning of the 2nd century before the Common Era. There are other works that we think were probably written during this time. Tobit, for example, some of the Enochic literature, the early Enochic literature we think was written at this time. I'm speaking about, of course, Jewish sources. And then we have stories that we find in Josephus, which of course was written much later, but he talks about this period, not that much, but there is some material that Josephus focuses on the early Hellenistic period. And all of this literary material is problematic for reconstructing what was going on. Of course, the things that are written later are problematic, but even the sources that are written during this period, if we're focused on the ordinary people, these literary sources are going to be problematic. These literary sources are written by literati. They're written by intellectuals, and which is always going to be the problem when our focus, as ours is going to be on the ordinary people. So the literary sources are themselves problematic. In terms of material remains, which is always a much better source of information when we're trying
archaeology.
So the material remains includes archaeology. Let's start with archaeology. When we're talking about recognizing Judeans in Judea, so we have the geographic area of Judea, the borders more or less we know. I should just say Judea is a relatively small area. It's not the entire state of Israel of today, for sure. It's not even, it includes a relatively small area, I would say surrounding Jerusalem, a bit to the north, a bit to the west, to the east, let's say until the Jordan River, and to the south until En Gedi. But it's a relatively small area. Within that area, we do have sites that have been identified with levels from the early Hellenistic period, but in general, it's difficult to pinpoint levels from this period for a very simple reason. As you know, Alex, archaeologists love destruction. Archaeologists love destruction layers. And the reason is that destruction layers give us a very clear dates, right? If we have anything found underneath a destruction layer, we know that what we find under the destruction layer dates to either the destruction or before. When we have an area that hasn't undergone wars, earthquakes, and so on for an extended period of time, it's very difficult to get good dates for that period.
Yeah, to distinguish between the periods.
Exactly, to distinguish between the periods. So for example, from the 1st century of the Common Era, we have a lot of archaeology which is able to date very well the time period of the Great Revolt, right? Around the year 70, Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70, and around that time we have Gamla that was destroyed 3 years earlier, Masada that was destroyed 3 years later, and so on and so forth. Many sites that were destroyed by the Romans when they were putting down the Great Revolt. We don't have that in the early Hellenistic period because sites simply weren't destroyed. We don't have wars going through Judea at this time that would have destroyed any sites. So our archaeology is also problematic during this period. Aside from archaeology proper, though, we also have epigraphic evidence. We have papyrological evidence, so writings on papyrus from Egypt. And we also have numismatic evidence, coins. And this is going to be, these are going to be the kinds of data that I'll be drawing on very strongly in this book because, again, both the literary sources and the archaeology are somewhat problematic.
Professor Adler, so what was the cult of the people who lived in this Judea which you just described so well?
Okay, so first of all, we need to put aside the Torah. We need to put aside everything that we think of when we think of Judaism and not assume that this is what was going on during the early Hellenistic period, and look at what the evidence actually indicates. First of all, Yahwism continues. That there's no doubt about. We have the Judean names continue to use Yahwistic theophoric elements in their names. So the same kinds of names that we have from the Iron Age through the Persian period continue to be present into the early Hellenistic period. We find this on coins, we find this on papyri from Egypt, and we find it on inscriptions as well. So there's no doubt about that. Two questions we can ask, and that is, one, to what extent was this reverence for the Judean God exclusivist? In other words, were Judeans recognizing and perhaps even revering other gods aside from the Judean national God? And to what extent was there perhaps other kinds of at least recognition of other kinds of gods? So I'll answer that question first. The other question that I just want to put on the table is the question of cult. What did the Yahwistic cult look like? So do we have a temple in Jerusalem? Do we have perhaps other temples? What was going on in terms of the way that the Judeans served their national God? The first question in terms of the exclusivity of Yahwistic worship. Again, our evidence is, we don't have a lot of evidence. We don't have a lot of data. But there are, I would say, at least hints that Yahwistic worship was not completely exclusivist, as it hadn't been during the Persian period. I'll remind you, during the Persian period, at sites like Elephantine in Mesopotamia as well, we have evidence of Judeans recognizing and even revering multiple gods. It seems that this continued to one extent or another into the early Hellenistic period, and I'll give you a couple of data points. We can't talk about a panoramic view of what was going on at this time, but we can speak of certain data points. One of the pieces of evidence which I find particularly intriguing is the coins from Judea. During the early Hellenistic period, we have the Judeans in Judea, in a mint, probably in Jerusalem, are continuing to produce coins which say on them Yehud, Yud He Dalet, the name of the province. Some of these coins also have the name of the governor. We're talking about the beginning of the early Hellenistic period, so there's still a governor in Judea. And the governor, there's a governor whose name is Chizkiah, so this is a Yahwistic name. And we have another coin that has the name of the Judean high priest. It's recently been reread. In the past, we thought the name was Yochanan. Today, we think the name is Yochaniah HaKohen. Yochaniah, the priest, the high priest.
Yahwistic name.
It's again, perfect. Yeah, exactly a Yahwistic name, a beautiful Yahwistic name. We have, so these two Yahwistic names, one is a governor, one is the high priest. On both of these coins, we have on the face of the coin a human or a human-like face, front-facing. And on the back of the coin, we have the owl of Athena. Now, finding the owl of Athena is not so surprising on coins from this time. Already in the Persian period, Judeans are minting coins which are essentially copies of Athenian coins, coins that were minted in Athens, which have Athena on one side and Athena's owl on the other side. These are coins being minted by Judeans in Persian era Jerusalem. And one can argue, and I think it's a good argument, that we shouldn't extract too much information from a coin like this that has Athena on one side and her owl on the other side, because these are simply copies of Athenian coins. I think that's certainly an argument that can be made. But once we get into the early Hellenistic period, we have these new coins that are not copies of any Athenian coins. These are new coins with a new artistic motif that hadn't appeared before. I said that the front of the coin had a human-like face. It appears that these coins are depicting the shield of Athena, or her aegis. And this is a coin which is depicting something to do with the goddess Athena, right? On a coin that's being minted by Judeans, not only Judeans, the governor and the Judean high priest in Jerusalem, with Athena motifs. Now, one might ask, what is Athena doing on coins that are being minted by Judeans in Jerusalem in the beginning of the early Hellenistic period. Recall, Alex, that in Elephantine, remember I mentioned probably the consort of Yahweh, Anat Yahweh. Anat was a Semitic goddess that apparently was being revered by Judeans in the Persian period, in the 5th century before the Common Era. There's good evidence that Anat was identified with Athena. So this is the same goddess.
Same motif.
It's the same goddess. So for the Semitic peoples, the Phoenicians and other Semitic peoples, apparently Judeans as well, her name was Anat. This appears already in Canaanite literature, in Ugarit and so on. The name of the warrior goddess was Anat. This same warrior goddess, virgin warrior goddess that we have in the East, is called Athena amongst the Greeks. So we have Phoenician inscriptions which equate Athena with Anat. We find Anat Yahweh in the 5th century amongst Judeans in Elephantine, and we find Athena on coins of Judeans in Jerusalem at the end of the 4th century. So there seems to be a continuity there in terms of recognizing Athena / Anat from the Persian period into the early Hellenistic period. So it's a data point, right? This doesn't prove that all Judeans were worshiping Athena, but it is a data point which, at the very least, shows that Judeans were comfortable using depictions of Athena and the attributes that surround her aegis and her owl. That's one data point. We have another inscription from Greece, which speaks of a Judean, a self-identifying Judean, whose name was Maschos, son of Maschion, and he set up a stele, an inscription in Greece, which speaks about having received a dream from the gods, and on the basis of this dream, he set up this inscription. So again, this is one person, a self-identifying Judean, but polytheism is not foreign to him. And we have some evidence also from Egypt as well that Judeans were setting up inscriptions in non-Judean temples, the temple to Pan in southern Egypt as well. These are data points. They don't give us a large picture of what's going on with everyone, but I would say that coins being minted in Jerusalem that are being used by everybody in Jerusalem, in Judea, are at least suggestive. So in terms of the exclusivity, I would say at the very least, we have very little reason to think that the Judean god was being worshipped exclusively by the Judeans, and that there wasn't at least a recognition of other gods, as was the case in the Persian period. So I don't see any difference between the Persian period and the early Hellenistic period. That's in terms of the exclusivity question. In terms of what the cult, the Yahwistic cult looked like, we know that there was a temple in Jerusalem. We know already from the Persian period there was a temple. We have evidence from Elephantine where the Judeans in Elephantine were writing to the high priest, the Kahana Rabbah, the high priest of Jerusalem, in the 5th century, towards the end of the 5th century before the Common Era. So there's and the priests of Jerusalem are mentioned in this letter as well.
And we know in Elephantine there was a temple.
We know that there was a temple in Elephantine. So
and
Jerusalem.
Some scholars say today that at that time in Egypt we had at least another one.
There was
maybe we had 2 temples.
At least.
At least.
So the Jerusalem temple, if we're talking about exclusivity or centralization, there's no centralization of the cult only in Jerusalem in the Persian period. And by the way, there's no reason to think that the priests in Jerusalem had any problem with there being a temple elsewhere. So that's the situation in the Persian period. The question is, what happens afterwards when we get into the early Hellenistic period? So first of all, in terms of what was going on in the Jerusalem temple, we don't know. We know that there are priests, we know that there's a temple, there are sacrifices. Temples we have throughout the ancient world. Every identity group has its own temples, and the temples are ubiquitous. We find them everywhere throughout the ancient world. The Judeans have their temple in Jerusalem, and the question is, do they have temples elsewhere? It's a good question. We know that there were other Yahwistic temples in the early Hellenistic period. First of all, we have the temple at Gerizim. So archaeologically, we have a temple at Gerizim already from the Persian period, and it continues into the early Hellenistic period. Essentially, it continues until the end of the 2nd century before the Common Era, when it was destroyed by John Hyrcanus, the Hasmonean. So a temple we have in Jerusalem, a temple we have in Gerizim. There are some indications that there might be something going on in Lachish. In Idumea, there might have been a Yahwistic temple. These were not necessarily Judeans that built these temples. Certainly in Gerizim, the people of Samaria that had built the temple. But there's a good question of whether Judeans might have visited these other temples. So is it possible that Judeans might have made pilgrimage, or at least visited occasionally other Yahwistic temples? Is an open question. There are some indications that perhaps in Gerizim there might have been Judeans coming to visit. Gad Barnea has written about this, an inscription which mentions perhaps a Judean coming from Judea to visit and sacrifice in the temple at Gerizim. In Egypt, there are indications that we might have another temple in Edfu. And Gad Barnea, again, has argued that the Judeans of Elephantine, once the temple there was destroyed, at some point during the 4th century before the Common Era, may have moved to Edfu nearby in southern Egypt and built a temple there. We have evidence of priests in Edfu, Judean priests in Edfu, and the title priest might refer to what they were doing for a living. So in other words, it wasn't only a name like Cohen, but they were actually Kohanim. They were actually functioning priests in a functioning temple.
We can assume that they worshipped God and they had a temple.
There is reason to think that they actually might have had a temple. Another interesting thing that we find in Egypt during the 3rd century before the Common Era, so again, we're in this early Hellenistic period, we find an institution which is called a proseuchē in Greek, which literally means prayer or a place of prayer. We begin to find inscriptions which that were made by Judeans in Egypt, dedication inscriptions for these proseuchē, for these places of prayer. What was this proseuchē? So often people think of these as synagogues. But the synagogue that we find later, from the Hasmonean period and onward, was an institution where we have Torah reading. Right? These were educational institutions. These were places where the Torah was being read and interpreted. This is the synagogue that we find in the New Testament. This is the synagogue that we find in Philo and our archaeological synagogues in Judea as well.
And the biblical scroll is a central place in these synagogues.
Exactly. So
taking the stage, we assume they have the text.
Precisely. So the Pentateuch is probably the most important of the biblical books that are being read in the synagogue, but other biblical texts as well. We have in the New Testament Jesus reading from a scroll of Isaiah in a synagogue. This is all in the synagogue that we find from the Hasmonean period and onward, once we have Judaism. This proseuchē institution appears before the Hasmonean period. It appears already in the 3rd century in inscriptions in the 3rd century. And the question is, what was going on in this institution? So the name implies that prayer was taking place. Were sacrifices taking place there? Was incense being burned there? In other words, were these essentially a kind of temple? And that is something of an open question. There are some indications which connect the proseuchē with temples, and there's some reason to think, again, there's no smoking gun here, but there is some reason to think that the proseuchē was a sort of temple. And again, that would suggest that we have less of a centralization of the cult than one might think. And again, if that's the case, we would have a continuation of what we had from the Persian period rather than something new, some kind of centralization where only Jerusalem is the only place where we can have the cult.
You told us that the Hellenic culture, the Greek culture, is dominant at this period of time. How it affects Judeans?
That's an excellent question. When you say that Hellenistic culture or Greek culture was dominant, we often think that with the beginning of the Hellenistic period, after the conquests of Alexander the Great, Greek culture takes over everything. That's not the case. And of course, there's no reason to think that Greek culture would immediately take over everything. And the question is, how quickly did Greek culture, how long did it take for Greek culture to spread? What was going on in the beginning? And that's the question that I look at in terms of Judeans. So we can break that larger question up into smaller edible bits, and we can ask very specific questions. We can look at things like Greek language, Greek naming conventions, and we can also look at material culture. So do we have Greek material culture that's starting to come into use in Judean society? So let's deal with each of those one at a time. Greek language. Are Judeans using Greek in the early Hellenistic period, right? And to what extent, if they are? So let's remember that before the conquests of Alexander the Great, the language that was dominant in this region was Aramaic. We have Aramaic, we also have Hebrew that's being used amongst Judeans. And by the way, I should mention, we're not talking only about Judeans in Judea. During this period of time, we've been speaking about the Judeans in Elephantina, we've been speaking about Judeans in Mesopotamia. So in all of this area, the language that was being spoken was Aramaic, and Hebrew is the traditional language of the Judeans going back to the Iron Age, and it's still being used. We have on coins, for example, I mentioned the coin of Yochania HaKohen. That's the Hebrew version of the name that appears on the coin. So Hebrew hasn't died out. Hebrew is still being used. When the Greeks come, what do we find in terms of inscriptions? Do we have any kinds of Greek inscriptions from Judeans in this early period? Let's break this question up into two. Let's speak about Judea and elsewhere. So in Judea, from the early Hellenistic period, we have not that many inscriptions, but we have some. All of them are in Aramaic. There's not a single Greek inscription which dates to before 175, the end of the early Hellenistic period. Not a single Greek inscription that relates to Judeans has been found in Judea. They're all in Aramaic. The coins are all in Hebrew. The coins don't have very much writing, but they are in Hebrew. There's, from the time of Ptolemy the First, there's one Greek letter on the coin, but we still have Hebrew. We have Yehuda written on the coins, Judea. So of the little evidence we have, Aramaic continues to be the language of the Judeans until the beginning of the 2nd century before the Common Era. In Egypt, the story is a little bit more complicated. So we do have papyri and inscriptions on stone in Aramaic continuing into the early Hellenistic period. We also have the beginning of Greek. So Judeans in Egypt are beginning to adopt Greek as a language, at least as a language for writing. And the question is, what does that indicate? The question is, does that indicate some kind of rejection of earlier Judean culture, of the Judean language, Aramaic, or should we be interpreting this as something more practical? So in order to get along with the surrounding culture, which is increasingly a Greek culture, you need language. And in order to be able to interact in terms of commercial interaction with the government and so on and so forth, there was a need to adopt Greek as the language of interaction. So we do have, to a degree, Greek being used by Judeans in Egypt. The question is how much should we infer from this that there's some kind of revolutionary change going on culturally. We also don't know what language people were speaking. So the language of writing is not necessarily exactly the same as the language that's used amongst Judeans for everyday language. So that's another question we need to ask. So in short, in terms of language, Judea, we have no evidence that Greek has made any inroads at all. And Egypt, to a degree, we do have Greek being adopted, but again, it could be that this was mainly for interactions with non-Judeans at this time. The second issue that I raised was the question of naming conventions. In Judea, Judeans continue to use Judean names. We have no evidence of Greek names being used at all at this time. Again, the evidence is we don't have that much, we don't have that many names, Judean names from Judea at this time, but amongst the names that we have, they are all traditional Judean names, no Greek names. In Egypt, like with a language, we begin to see the use of Greek names, including, by the way, Greek names with theophoric elements of Greek gods. So that ties into what we were talking about in terms of the exclusivity of the Yahwistic worship at this time. But we do begin to see the adoption of Greek names. If you count, and you could actually make a statistic here of what percentage of the names are Judean, what percentage of the names are Greek. A bit over half of the names are traditional Judean names throughout the early Hellenistic period until approximately 175 BCE. So again, we see inroads, cultural inroads of the adoption of Greek names, but this doesn't completely take over. We continue to see the Judean names that we had from the Iron Age through the Persian period into the early Hellenistic period. So there's no rupture here. There is a strong sense of continuity.
Professor Adler, I have a question with regard to that. So does it mean that we can derive a conclusion that there is a difference between the cult or way of the worship in the Judea, the mainland, and for example in Egypt, among the Judeans?
Yeah, so that's a good question in terms because of the names you're asking. So it's interesting that we have this the adoption of names with non-Judean theophoric elements, non-Yahwistic theophoric elements. The question is, how much should we derive from that? So let's take an example from today. If you have a Jew whose name is Christopher, does that suggest that he is necessarily a Christ believer? Right? Not necessarily. It could be that we have to remember names are important conventions for interaction. So if you have a name, your name Alex is a simple name that everyone throughout the world can relate to. But if, some people have names that are more unusual. Yonatan might not come off the tongue of everyone everywhere around the world, but Jonathan might be an easier name. Christopher might be an even easier name for, let's say, Americans. So having a name that people can relate to, and people recognize, is useful for commercial interactions, political interactions, and so on and so forth. So it could be that Judeans took on these names of Greek deities because these were popular names, and it doesn't necessarily indicate anything about cult. We have to be careful. I'm not saying, it definitely has nothing to do with it, but we shouldn't. I would be careful about concluding that these names necessarily indicate that we have reverence for Greek gods. But it is interesting that we find this in Egypt and we don't find it in Judea. Again, the evidence is we don't have a lot of evidence, so we have to be very careful with what we see. But indeed, in Egypt we have it. In Judea we don't.
Maybe the tricky question: the Septuagint, translation of the biblical text to the Greek language. Why it was done? What was the purpose of this translation?
Okay, so that's an excellent question. Hidden, I think, within your question is my conclusion in my first book was that we don't have any evidence that there is widespread knowledge of the Torah, of the Pentateuch, prior to the Hasmoneans. The Septuagint, scholars think, was probably translated, so that the Pentateuch was probably translated into Greek already sometime in the 3rd century before the Common Era. And that might be. The question is, why was it translated? What purpose did it have some kind of function within Judean society at this time? These are questions which we don't know the answers to. The fact that the Pentateuch was translated does not indicate in any way that this text was necessarily well known, right? So it's easy to imagine that the text was translated by intellectuals who were interested in the text, and it didn't have any function within Judean society. So there are scholars that have suggested, that have imagined that the Pentateuch was translated so that it could be used for liturgical purposes in synagogues. We don't have any evidence for that. We don't have any evidence that this text was being read for Judeans in any large-scale way. And in fact, although, as I said, Greek begins to come into play with Judeans are still using Aramaic. They're still speaking Aramaic. So the idea that they would have had a need for a translation of the Pentateuch into Greek doesn't really hold water, right? I think that the Septuagint was translated, if it indeed was translated as early as the 3rd century, it was translated for scholastic reasons, and it was, if it was all being read at this time, then it would have been likely amongst a small group of people, of intellectuals, of literate people, and none of this really has much to say about what ordinary Judeans were reading or had any interest in.
You explained us about the texts mainly, but before that you mentioned material culture.
Yeah.
What we have about that? What you can say about that?
Okay, so the question here is, to what degree did Greek material culture begin to influence Judeans in the early Hellenistic period? I'm going to focus here on Judea because it's difficult to identify Judean settlements, Judean neighborhoods outside of Judea. In a place like Egypt, for example, we have texts that mention Judeans, but to identify an actual archaeological layer that relates specifically to Judeans is very difficult outside of Judea. So I'm going to focus here on Judea proper. In Judea, we have, and here let's begin with the pottery. So we have in the southern Levant the adoption of Greek pottery, or the importation of Greek pottery, and then more importantly for me is the imitation of Greek pottery amongst local potters in the southern Levant. We begin to see this in the 3rd century before the Common Era, everywhere except for Judea. So the Greek styles of pottery that we begin to find in northern sites along the coast, we don't find in Judea, not until the Hasmonean period. In the Hasmonean period, Judean potters begin to imitate Greek styles. We don't have that in the early Hellenistic period. Interestingly, there's one particular type of vessel, the casserole, which which is brought in with the Greeks. We don't have it before that. We don't have it in the Persian period. And Andrea Berlin, who studies pottery in general, and particularly this phenomenon, has suggested that the importation of the casserole is indicative not only of the pottery itself, but of a different kind of a cuisine, which was brought in with the Greeks, and which was adopted on a local level. And again, when we look at when the casserole begins to be imitated by local potters, it begins in the 3rd century amongst potters outside of Judea. Judeans only begin to adopt the casserole and the cuisine that it represents, again, only in the Hasmonean period. So it took some time, at least if we're looking at the pottery traditions, for Greek influence to be felt in Judea. The revolution, I don't know if we can speak about a revolution, but the change is after the Hasmoneans come to power. In terms of architecture, we can also speak about Greek influences. So we know, of course, the Greek temples with their architecture, the entablature, the Greek columns, the Greek friezes, and so on and so forth. And all of the details that we find surrounding Greek architecture. Again, we don't have evidence for that before the Hasmonean period. It seems that before the Hasmonean period, the Greek influences in general, so we spoke about language, we spoke about naming conventions, in terms of material culture as well, it takes quite some time from the time that Alexander the Great conquered this area until the Hellenistic Greek cultural influences actually begin to appear. It takes about a century and a half, 2 centuries, until they actually begin to appear in Judea. So it takes quite some time.
Maybe it's a time to go back to beginning of our conversation and to ask again, what actually is your conclusion? What we have in this time between the Yahwism and the Judaism?
Right. So again, to make clear the question, when we're talking about this period before the Hasmonean period, the period before when I identify the beginning of Judaism, should we be looking at this early Hellenistic period as something of a continuation from the Persian period before it, or the seeds, the beginning of what we begin to see in the Hasmonean period, in the late Hellenistic period, as Judaism? And from everything we've discussed today, when we're talking about in terms of the cult, in terms of Greek influences, in terms of governance is another matter which we didn't speak that much about. The high priest in Jerusalem seems to be the local leader that we have during the early Hellenistic period. All of the cultural and cultic features that we find in Judea and amongst Judeans in general in the early Hellenistic period very much look like a continuation of what we have from the Persian period. That's not to say that everything was the same, that there are no changes, but there are certainly lines of continuation from the Persian period into the early Hellenistic period. The conquests of Alexander the Great were not some kind of break, there were not some kind of watershed between what came before and what came after. Judeans continue to speak Aramaic. The cult, we don't see any great differences between the Persian period and the early Hellenistic period in terms of language, in terms of culture in general. There seems to be a lot of continuity. Therefore, I think the answer to your question is that we need to continue to speak about Yahwism in the early Hellenistic period. The seeds of Judaism have not yet been sown. Now, that is not to say that Judaism just appears out of nowhere with the Hasmonean period. Okay? We have to remember that the central texts of Judaism, when Judaism does appear, the Pentateuch and the rest of the biblical corpus, most of these texts were written quite early. So they were written, we don't know exactly when, but once we get to the early Hellenistic period, most of these texts were probably written, and they were being edited during this time. This is what biblical scholars will tell you. These texts were being passed on amongst scribes, probably amongst small groups of scribes. Some of the texts might have been sitting on shelves somewhere in the Jerusalem temple, I don't know. But the early Hellenistic period is important in terms of the development of Judaism, because it's during this time that these texts are being passed down. Now again, they're being passed down amongst small groups of people, so they're not affecting larger Judean society. But it is a period when the texts are being, like I said, copied, edited, and when they burst onto the stage of society, once we reach the Hasmonean period, we can say that the Judaism of the Hasmonean period does owe its development, its embryonic development, to the early Hellenistic period. But in terms of what the question that we had posed in the beginning, if you were to meet a Judean on the street, if you were to meet a Judean in the marketplace, a Judean living in the early Hellenistic period his life probably would have looked much like the life of his ancestors who lived a few generations before in the Persian period. I think the early Hellenistic period should be looked at as a continuation from the Iron Age through the Persian period into the early Hellenistic period. The watershed really comes to my mind in the Hasmonean period. So that's the real watershed if we're looking for one. It's with the Hasmonean period when we have something completely new. We have for the first time an independent Judean polity. This new polity eventually becomes a kingdom. And with that, we have something completely new. With that, we have the adoption of the Torah as law. With that, we have the increasing adoption of Greek influences, whether it's in terms of language, whether it's in terms of naming conventions, whether it's in terms of material culture. All of these things that we were looking at that hadn't really taken root in the early Hellenistic period suddenly emerge during the late Hellenistic period, during the Hasmonean period. And I think for good reason. Once we have an independent Judean polity, the Judeans became a real force on the regional stage. And once the Judeans have their own government, then it makes sense for us to have a local law that governs everyone. It makes sense for the dominant Greek culture that we have in the entire region, in Egypt, in Syria, in Mesopotamia, in Asia Minor, this entire region, Greek is the dominant culture. In order to be a player on the stage, the Hasmoneans and the Judean people of the time of the Hasmonean period need to adopt these cultural elements in order to become, like I said, players on the stage. So all of these things really emerge after the Hasmoneans take control. I think if we're looking for a watershed, the Hasmonean period is really the period to be looking at. Before that, it's a continuation. Once we reach the Hasmonean Revolution, we have a revolution. We have something new.
Professor Yonatan Adler, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. And I must admit that every meeting with you is very inspiring, and we are always getting a lot of knowledge. Thank you so much for your readiness to share this knowledge with the public. And guys, stay tuned for more on KEDEM Channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe. And we have now a Patreon, and it would be a great way to support what we are doing. by joining Patreon. Thank you so much again, Professor Adler.
Thank you for coming, Alex. Always a pleasure.